Hi, this is Jack Stanley. I wanted to share some memories. I have lived 6 decades, and in those 6 decades, I have seen an awful lot, and I've always had an eye for history. And so I'd like to share some of the things that I observed and saw during my life. I anticipate seeing a great deal more as time goes on, but the first 60 years I think would be fun to share with you. Now, I was born in the 1950s, in an age before Sputnik, um, where outer space was science fiction. Computers, well, we didn't quite know what they were. Cars had fins. Bakelite was plastic. TV dinners were just coming out, and they were like Buck Rogers, like real exciting things to have. Television was a little idiot box. You had to hit it occasionally. You had rabbit ears on top. Or if you were very wealthy, you had an antenna on the roof. Usually your best reception was when you held it. Very interesting time. We kept talking about the future, the future, the future. I am a what you might call a baby boomer. There's a lot of us. There was a lot of baby boomers born, and now the baby boomers are, well, we're not babies anymore. Now we're going the other direction. And something interesting about getting older is the fact that you start raising a tally, and then you suddenly realize that more people who are or were friends are dead than alive. It's pretty shocking, when you start taking a tally. About 60% are dead and 40% are alive. Gives you an idea of how old you are when you start having things like that happen. So nonetheless, I grew up, as I said, in the 50s and 60s. And I got to see the world from a very curious boy's window. I looked at everything. I studied everything. I was fascinated with history. So I looked at everything I saw with an eye on history. One of the first things I recall was the Cuban Missile Crisis. This was a really frightening moment in time. I remember it because there were several different things going on at that time. My father had just bought a new Chevrolet Bel Air. And that Bel Air, he wanted to put seat covers on it. And in those days, they would put these plastic beaded seat covers on these cars. Now, several factors. First off, the plastic would get hard as rock in the winter and hotter than blazes in the summer. And they were just damn uncomfortable, but it made the seats last because they were fabric and they would wear out quick. Well, nonetheless, at this time, my father and I went with my dad. We went to get the seat cushions put on. And that was right at that time that the Cuban Missile Crisis was going on. So it's October 1962. I remember talking to my grandfather about this, and he was in shock about the whole thing. My grandfather at that point was just a few years older than I am now, which is kind of scary when you think of it. But he was a World War I veteran. He had been wounded in World War I, and on November the 9th, 1918, 2 days before the end of the war, he got shot. Really banged him up badly. He never quite got over his wounds, and he died in 1968. But the Cuban Missile Crisis got the attention of the world. We watched Kennedy on television as he was talking about it. And my grandfather was saying, like, my God, it's the end of the world. I remember he was kind of hysterical about it. I looked at it like a kid. I mean, I was like going, wow, it's interesting. But the end of the world? Nah. Well, it wasn't. And of course, Kennedy came across as quite the hero. Of course, we know better now historically that it wasn't quite as much his bravado as a number of other things. There was a lot of other things going on there. There was a lot of deals being made. There was a lot of mistakes being made. Khrushchev did a lot too. You know, we have to give him credit. But Kennedy did a pretty good job on it. And of course, he became sort of like Sir Lancelot in our eyes. I mean, everybody was really happy about him and pretty proud of him at that point. And at that point, I was starting to watch his press conferences shortly after the Cuban Missile Crisis, and they were great entertainment. And I didn't understand everything, but he was fun to watch because he made everybody laugh and he was entertaining. And I said, boy, this is great. I didn't realize how much fun a politician could be. Little did I know there never would be another one like that. The rest of them were about as exciting as a root canal. But nonetheless, he was in the news a lot. A lot of things was happening at that time. We started having issues with race relations. That was a pretty rough time. You know, I'm old enough to remember a lot of this stuff. And I will admit we never gave it any thought. And the things, how people would talk years ago, it's pretty bad. I mean, but that was just normal. And I remember as a young kid being in Florida and seeing separate bathrooms and stuff like that. It was pretty awful. Of course, at the time, I don't know of how awful I thought it was. I just remembered seeing it. Today, I just can't believe it. But nonetheless, 13 months after the Cuban Missile Crisis, Kennedy was assassinated. I was in school, and it's 2 o'clock. And the teacher came into the class, and you know, years ago, the way it would work in classes, and it's a lot different today, but they would hold up a piece of paper and talk into the ear of the teacher. So someone came into the room, talked to our teacher, and she burst into tears, hysterically. Now, initially, we're kids. We kind of thought it was kind of funny. It was pretty cool. Our teacher is hysterical. Our parents were called. Of course, my father was working. My mom was home. And my mom came to pick me up in a 1962 Ford Falcon, which was my grandparents' car. I remember that. It had fins on the back and had a choke you pull out to adjust it. Even though it was automatic, it had a choke. And she came to get me. She went to the dry cleaners. They were hysterical. And then we went home. My father came home early from work. I mean, you have to understand that the entire United States ground to a halt. To a degree. Some things would go on. There would be sports events and stuff like that. I know my father went to see some sports game while the funeral was going on. That's just the way he was at the time. And, well, I sat in front of that TV all day for the 3 days with my mother mainly. And she was so upset, she ate an entire bowl of Tootsie Rolls. In fact, I cannot look at a Tootsie Roll without thinking of the Kennedy assassination. I mean, just the way things were. My mother was madly in love with John F. Kennedy. He was kind of like a hero to me. I liked him too. And it was so sad to see him die. And you know, it's 52 years now. And I still have pangs of remorse. And when I see stuff, you get that feeling again that that we had at that time. I mean, we were really hurt. Other things that happened while that was going on, I saw Oswald killed on live television. Everybody saw it. It was pretty shocking stuff. In fact, we didn't know exactly what had happened initially. I mean, because it was so fast. And you have to understand, our minds, we weren't geared for TV. Like today, people observe everything. In those days, it was like a radio with a picture, and so everybody was watching it, and you'd see stuff, and a commentator would say, and now we're going to do blah, blah, blah. You know, and that's the way television worked. It wasn't like today, how they're like following people around, stuff like that. All the cameras were set in one spot, and an announcer was sitting there with a microphone that was hooked to a wire, and he was hooked up to a camera that had tubes, and so the camera couldn't move, the reporter couldn't move much, and so everybody had to wait for the action to come to them. And so it was a little different and kind of fascinating. Well, of course, Oswald was shot, and it just added more bizarre natures to this whole thing. And then the Kennedy assassination was over, and the country kind of got back into its grips. We had our next president, which I didn't find at all exciting, Lyndon Johnson. But then something happened that was remarkable. And that was in the beginning of 1964. The Beatles came. And I was mad about the Beatles. I thought they were the best thing in the world, and I got their records. I had a Beatles guitar. I had their pictures on the wall. You have to understand what a phenomena the Beatles were. You know, think about this, that when they arrived in the United States in early 64, the United States was still kind of in mourning for JFK, and they were wearing suits, and they were very prim, very proper. They did the Ed Sullivan show. Have to get that right. And it was great. I watched that thing. My grandparents' television, they had a bigger TV. I think it was like, I don't know, 13 inches. Black and white, of course. And it had one of those old cases. You had to open up the doors in the front to see the television. And it was old RCA. And I sat there and mesmerized by the Beatles. And it's interesting how the Beatles would totally affect a generation. The way we dressed, the way we cut our hair, the way we lived, the way we talked, it all was influenced to a great deal by the Beatles. They had such a profound effect upon our lives. And so the Beatles became a major factor. Once again, school. And the other thing that was going on at that time, once again, is going back, is dealing with race. It was a bad time. You know, we had Martin Luther King Jr., and he would be on television a lot, and we would watch him. And he was quite eloquent, fascinating individual. And there was a lot of stuff going on. It was bad. I don't know how else to put it. But eventually things started to straighten out, but unfortunately, he would be assassinated in 1968. And once again, the 1960s was a rough decade. Bad in so many ways and amazing in so many others. Shortly after Martin Luther King, Robert Kennedy was assassinated in California. And there was a massive television and mourning period because the train brought his body all over the place, and people would... It was a long, drawn-out affair, and it was pretty sad. I remember a lot more of the Robert Kennedy assassination than the John F. Kennedy assassination. I was 5 years older. And I remember my mother coming to me shortly after Robert Kennedy had been shot. And I remember as Robert Kennedy had been shot. I was watching television, and they had an interview with Robert Frost and Robert Kennedy talking, and I marveled. I said, "Wow, it's kind of neat to see." And my mom said, "Pray for President. Pray for Senator Kennedy," and I did. And he would die, and that was a sad period. You had Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy, and everything was pretty bad in those days. You had all the riots going on, so many awful things happening. In the midst of all of this, starting in the early 60s, you had the space program, which was the amazing part. I mean, President Kennedy announced that we're going to go to the moon by 1969. Everybody thought that was next to impossible, but nonetheless, we all watched as the Mercury, Gemini, and later Apollo missions went. And in July of 1969, sitting with my mother, I watched Neil Armstrong take that step. The picture was upside down when it first was broadcast. It was kind of bouncing around a little bit, and then it straightened out. And then Buzz Aldrin came down. And it's interesting to note that many, many years later, I got to interview Buzz Aldrin, and we had a nice conversation, and we talked about the moon and other stuff. But the 1960s were an incredible decade, and so many different things. And I want to talk about some of the stuff that I observed from the eyes of a kid. You know, we always hear from adults, but it's interesting to look at a period of time from that of a kid. And I will continue this in part 2 of talking about some of the early years of my life. Thank you.